Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing Fixing Elections, the Failure of America's Winner-Take-All Politics. I'm Jamie Paglia. Cambridge Forum is now in its 36th season of bringing you live public programs for the discussion of the issues and ideas that are shaping our world. A recent study found that the last 4 decades of the 20th century saw the longest period of voter decline in our nation's history. Among the explanations for this trend was the Electoral College that renders non-swing states irrelevant in deciding elections. Has voter apathy grown too great? Is our current voting system broken beyond repair? What can be done to restore America's faith in participatory democracy? Stephen Hill believes that the root of our political failures is our geographic-based winner-take-all electoral system. In his new book, he discusses this 18th century political model and says that it's antiquated and in desperate need of overhaul, and proposes a solution for change based on European political models. Mr. Hill is senior analyst for the Center for Voting and Democracy in Washington, D.C. His analyses and commentaries have been published in dozens of magazines and journals, including the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, and The Nation. Previously, he co-authored Reflecting All of Us. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Stephen Hill.
Thank you, Jamie, and the Cambridge Forum. It's really a pleasure to be here, especially I've always heard about Cambridge Forum and what a great venue it is, and you look at the list of people who have spoken here before, and maybe some of you have attended those talks, and so I'm deeply honored and thrilled to be here, and particularly now to talk about democracy, you know, a subject that often it gets maligned but not often discussed in a very deliberative fashion. And so what I took on to do was to write a book about something that often doesn't get looked at very much, and that is our voting system, the winner-take-all voting system. You know, and a lot of people say, voting system, I mean, what's so important about that? And in fact, we at the organization that I work for, the Center for Voting and Democracy, we have a slideshow that I don't have with me, so I can't show you. But if I could show it to you, what you would see is that you can take the same votes and put them through different voting systems. So, you know, district elections versus at-large elections versus cumulative voting, proportional representation, instant runoff voting, these different voting systems that are being used not only in the United States but all over the world. You take the same votes, put them through different voting systems, and you can come up with completely different results in terms of who gets elected. I mean, think about that. And what does it mean that that's true and that we don't really pay very much attention to voting systems and really understanding how they're impacting our democracy? And what I focused on in my book, Fixing Elections, are 5 areas that are being impacted, and as I came to the conclusion, very negatively by the winner-take-all system. And the winner-take-all system is basically an 18th century political device. It was devised by the framers and founders at the founding of our nation, when things like proportional representation and instant runoff voting and cumulative voting, these other systems, hadn't been invented yet. So they drew upon the best knowledge that they had at the time to come up with the best system at the time. But now here we are over 200 years later. We know quite a bit more about the subject than they knew at that time. And what I have come to believe is that, for various reasons, the winner-take-all system in this 18th century system in the 21st century is really not working particularly well. So I looked at 5 areas: participation, representation, campaigns and discourse, and what I found to be an astonishing loss of political ideas that's going on in this country right now. Also, it's the impact on legislative policy and the impact on national unity. And I just want to run through each one of these a little bit and give you a flavor for where things are. In terms of participation, we just had an election to elect our national legislature in November 2002, to elect the Congress. The voter turnout, anyone know what the voter turnout was in 2002? Anyone want to guess? 38%? Any other guesses? 40? I mean, should we know that? Is that something that's important to know? It was 39% of eligible adult voters that turned out to vote. 39%. So 61% of people eligible to vote did not turn out to vote. You compare that to a country like Germany, which doesn't use our winner-take-all system. They use proportional representation. They just had their national elections, and there they had an 80% voter turnout. Twice as many voters turned out to vote. In the 2000 presidential election, barely a majority of eligible voters turned out to vote. Not only the most powerful office in the United States, but the most powerful office in the world. You know, I bet if we were to allow other people around the world to vote for the President of the United States, they would turn out in droves to vote for that office. And here in the United States, we can barely get a majority of people to turn out to vote. Now, the other thing I discovered in terms of voter turnout, and I was quite shocked to discover, is that we're seeing an increase in single-digit voter turnout levels all across the country. So places like a Dallas mayoral election not that long ago, 5% voter turnout. Charlotte, North Carolina, 7%. The Attorney General's race in Virginia, for the highest law enforcement in the state of Virginia, 5% voter turnout for a primary there. Here in Massachusetts, recent election, the 2000 primary election, according to the Secretary of State of Massachusetts, you had less than 10% voter turnout in that primary. Now, single-digit voter turnout. Think about that. What does that mean? Where are we going? These are the questions that I tried to answer in my book. So, participation, things don't look so well. Let's look at representation very quickly. What's the percentage of women elected to the U.S. House of Representatives? Keeping in mind that the House of Representatives is what we call the People's House, right? What's the percentage of women in the U.S. House of Representatives? Anyone know? 25? Any other guesses? 16, 12? Again, should we know this? What does it mean that we don't know this? It was 14%. It's 14% right now. Okay? And you compare that again to a country like Sweden, which uses proportional representation. They just had their national elections. 44% of the legislators elected to their national parliament were women. You compare it to a country like Germany, which, interestingly enough, uses both our single-seat district winner-take-all system combined with a proportional representation system. So you have the same votes, the same voters, the same cultural assumptions being expressed through two different voting systems, and you see some rather interesting results. In the proportional representation vote, women in Germany won 39% of the seats. In the winner-take-all district vote, they won 13% of the seats. Okay? And you see that similarity in other nations around the world that use this mixed system. New Zealand, Italy, Russia, and Japan, for instance. Generally speaking, women win 2 or 3 times as many seats in the proportional representation vote as they do in the winner-take-all vote. I mean, this is important information, I would think. We should know this. And then you look at, what's the representation of racial minorities in this country? Racial minorities now have about 28% of the national population. What percentage of seats do they have in the People's House? Anyone want to guess?
Less than 10?
Less than 10? Any other guesses?
16.
16? Going once? Twice? 14%. So about half the representation that you'd expect them to have based on the population. In the United States Senate, there are no Latinos and no African Americans in the United States Senate. When that body meets and deliberates on confirming Supreme Court judges, confirming treaties, discussing whether to go to war or not, or in the other important issues they talk about, there are no African Americans and no Latinos. Okay? Now, some people say, well, do we really want to keep track of representation this way? By race or by gender? Well, we already do in a sense, because most of the people being elected are white men. And it's not a coincidence. I mean, race still matters in this country. We haven't turned the corner on that at all. And in fact, white men win most of the representation because of cultural and gender and racial attitudes that prevail in this country, and because of the winner-take-all system and how only one candidate can win. Only one side can win in a winner-take-all system. If I win, you lose. That's how it works. So representation, if you think of democracy as a patient, where you're trying to read the vital signs of the patient to see how well the patient is doing, the patient on the gurney here. And, we're reading the vital signs of democracy, voter turnout, representation. The oscilloscope's starting to look kind of like a flat line here. We're not doing real well. Now you look at other areas like legislative policy. A couple of researchers have estimated that the United States Congress is now on the same page as the American people about 40% of the time. It used to be about 65 to 70% of the time. Now, 40% of the time, the U.S. Congress passes legislation and policy that corresponds to what the American public says that we want. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for this. We can get into it in the question and answers, but it's very directly linked to our winner-take-all system, where you have, for instance, entire regions of the country that are breaking down along partisan lines, where, the Democrats will win the urban areas, for instance. and the high population urban areas. The Republicans will win the low population rural areas. And so there's no incentive in a Republican Congress, for instance, for them to do much for cities because they don't win seats there. They don't win votes there. And so they're trying to, bend to their constituents and where they win seats and votes, and so cities lose out in this kind of winner-take-all process. Whereas if we use a system, for instance, it's called cumulative voting in 3-seat districts, where all voters have 3 votes, and you can put all of them on one candidate if you want. You can express a strong preference for a particular candidate. And with this system, you need 25% of the vote to win 1 seat. Illinois actually used this type of system for 110 years. And what you saw, for instance, is that Chicago elected a few Republicans. Downstate in Illinois, in the rural areas, they elected some Democrats. And so you had more of a cross-pollination of ideas in the party caucuses, which is where the parties decide which policies to pursue. When the Republicans start saying, oh, forget the cities, there are Chicago Republicans there saying, hey, those are my constituents. We've got to do something about housing and transportation and education in the cities. We can't just forsake these people. But now, with our winner-take-all system in Illinois and other places, it's breaking down and balkanizing along regional and partisan lines, and it's having dramatic impact on policy that gets passed. And this is rather new in our nation's history. Previously, you would see some Republicans getting elected from cities. You'd see some Democrats getting elected from the rural areas. Here in the Northeast, you saw Rockefeller Republicans getting elected, and now it's becoming virtually a Democratic Party stronghold. So these sorts of balkanizations along regional and partisan lines are being woven into the fabric of our political system, and they're largely the result of this single-seat district winner-take-all system where one side wins and the other side loses. And one side is being overwhelmed by the other side in these regions that are so tilted for one party or the other. My book, Fixing Elections, some of you may have surmised, is kind of a double meaning to the title. It's the idea of fixing elections, offering some solutions, which the book does do. But there's also this idea that our elections are kind of fixed. They're rigged, in a sense. And I want to give you one idea of what that means. We just went through all across the country a process that's known as redistricting. Every 10 years, we have to redraw all the district lines at local, state, and federal levels. Once the census numbers come out, we have to readjust those lines to make sure they're approximately equal in population, that all the districts are equal in population. And what we saw across the country, in state after state, was what we call incumbent protection plans. The districts were drawn in such a way to protect the incumbents, to give them safe seats, to make sure they don't even have to run for re-election. They don't have to ask you for your vote or appeal to you for their vote because it's a safe seat. There's no chance they're going to lose. In California, for instance, it was perhaps its most egregious. The incumbents paid $20,000 apiece to the political consultant drawing the district lines to draw them a district in which they could not lose. Okay? I mean, think about that. That's protection money. That's insider trading, just like Enron of another sort. And this is what went on in California. And the political consultant was the brother of one of the incumbents. Talk about nepotism. And this kind of behavior went on all across the country, in state after state. In California, we have 53 U.S. House seats. 52 of them, as a result of this process, were won by huge landslide margins. The 53rd, the squeaker, was won by 14 percentage points. That was Gary Condit's old seat, right? So they basically did away with elections in California. There was no reason to have to turn out to vote. And they did that in state after state. In fact, it's so bad that we at the Center for Voting and Democracy, one of the things that we do, rather provocatively, is we predict elections months in advance without knowing anything about inequities in campaign finance. We don't even have to know who the candidates are. All we have to look is the partisan demographic of the districts and how they were drawn during the redistricting process, and you can predict the results. We've already predicted 359 out of 435 House seats for 2004. I mean, what does that mean? And we've been doing this for the last 8 years, and we've been 99.9% accurate. We not only predict who wins, we predict their margin of victory, whether they're going to win by 5 points or 10 points or 20 points. It's that predictable. And if we can do this, we're just a small nonprofit. The political insiders can do this as well. And so that means, when donors are giving money, right, to campaigns, they're giving to a candidate they know is going to win because the district has been drawn to produce that result. So through this redistricting process, usually after redistricting, every 10 years when we do this, after redistricting, you'd expect out of 435 House seats, about 110 to 120 of them will be up for grabs. They'll be competitive. Either party will have a chance of winning 110 or 120 of these seats. This time around, because of how they bent over backwards to protect incumbents using computers and sophisticated databases to basically slice and dice the electorate and create strange-looking districts. Some of them have been compared to the shape of Bullwinkle the moose and the squash mosquito district and the splattered spaghetti sauce district, all these sorts of districts. Because of how they manipulated this process, out of 435 House seats, about 35 of them this time around were up for grabs. 35 out of 435 were the only ones where we couldn't figure out who was going to win. And most of these races, as I said, are won by huge landslide margins. Okay? So this is what's happening to our political system as a result of this single-seat district system where you do things like redistricting. It means that you, the voter, your vote doesn't really count in these districts anymore. It's either wasted because you're in the wrong district. You're, say, a Democrat in a Republican district, or a Republican in a Democratic district, or a third-party supporter, you have no chance. It's either wasted or it's superfluous if it's from a district where you like the representative. Either way, there's not really a whole lot of incentive for you to turn out to vote. The other aspect I want to talk about of how we're losing our vote has to do with how they campaign today, using polls and focus groups to basically figure out who are the swing voters and what messages will appeal to these swing voters. And basically what they're doing in this process is they're figuring out which groups of voters to talk to and which groups of voters to ignore. Okay? And so, let's look at the presidential election in 2000. A close election, right? One of the closest in our history. And yet all the political insiders paying attention knew that 40 states were done deals. Everybody knew who was going to win. California, Texas, New York, Massachusetts. There were no campaigns in these states. It came down to just about 10 states where everyone knew it was going to be a close race. But even within those states, both sides had their polls and their focus groups to help them figure out who were the group of swing voters. So with the process of figuring out the swing voters, it's sort of like this. You're saying to yourself, okay, this group of voters over here, I know they're going to vote for me because they're never going to vote for my opponent. So I can take them for granted. I don't have to worry about them. This group of voters over here, I know they're never going to vote for me. So I don't worry about them either. Instead, I focus my campaign and narrow it in on just a handful of voters, this handful of undecided voters in what we call swing voters. And as one political consultant defined swing voters, they're the people who are oftentimes least interested and least knowledgeable about politics, and if you don't grab them in 8 seconds with your TV ad, you've lost them. Okay? So these are who the appeals are being made to, oftentimes, in our political system. So what should have been a national presidential election of, where we were debating our national future and having policy options put before us about important issues like globalization and international security and all the other issues that are out there, instead became a very narrow provincial election where just a handful of voters in a handful of states were going to determine who was going to win the presidency. And so in this process, basically most voters are being sliced and diced right out of the political process. I mean, there's a lot of talk about why don't young people participate? Well, I think a better question is why should young people participate? Because in this process, they're either living in a district that's been drawn to produce a safe seat so their vote doesn't count there, or they're in the wrong demographic, and even in a close race, where the politicians are not going to appeal to them. I mean, you think back to the presidential election, what were the issues they talked about? Social Security lockboxes, Medicare, prescription drugs. They talked about people that already have insurance. They didn't talk about the 45 million people in this country that don't have insurance. They're not on the political radar screen. They don't vote, and if they do vote, they vote probably Democratic, and so they're not in the group of swing voters. Instead, they appeal to this group of swing voters who are more attuned to these issues. And young people, poor people, people without health care, they're basically in the wrong demographic, and so the politicians don't try to speak to them. As I said earlier, these techniques they use, polls and focus groups, are basically being used to help them figure out which groups of voters to talk to and which groups of voters to ignore. That's what it's about. So in all this, when you look at redistricting, how they campaign, most voters are being just sliced and diced right out of the political process. So it's no wonder that our voter turnout is so low. I mean, it's not surprising at all. So just what, real quickly, I will say, what are some of the ways we can change this? And maybe in questions and answers, we can fill this out a little bit. If we start using things like proportional representation or instant runoff voting, with instant runoff voting, voters get to vote for the candidate they like, but they also have the option now of picking a second choice, a runoff choice, and ranking that candidate, and ranking a third choice. And if your first choice doesn't win, you haven't lost your vote goes to your runoff choice. So this means you don't have to worry about spoiler candidacies, and you don't have to worry about, right now we think, well, I like this candidate over here, but she or he doesn't stand a chance. So instead, I vote for the lesser of two evils because I don't want to end up with the candidate I like the least winning. In that mental process, we lose our inspiration and our enthusiasm. So with instant runoff voting, you get to vote for the candidate you truly like. And you don't have to worry about spoilers and lesser of two evils. If we had used instant runoff voting in the 2000 presidential election, the 100,000 Ralph Nader voters in Florida would have had the option of ranking their runoff choice, their second choice. There's no question that thousands of them would have put Al Gore as their second choice. And the winner in Florida would have ended up with a majority of the popular vote. Al Gore would have won Florida and would have won the presidency. And it's a good example of how voting systems really do matter. You use a different voting system, you can get a different result. So I thank you for listening. Now I can entertain questions. Is that how the format goes?
You are joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Stephen Hill discussing Fixing Elections, the Failure of America's Winner-Take-All Politics. So, Stephen, I'm actually going to give you a chance to sort of elaborate a little bit. In sort of layman's terms, why don't you walk us through some of these different electoral systems a bit more for people that are listening?
Sure. Proportional representation differs from the winner-take-all system in the following way. With winner-take-all, you use what's known as single-seat districts. You elect one district at a time, and everyone in that district gets to vote for the representative, and everyone else outside of that district does not get to vote in that race. And then everyone who votes for the winner gets a representative. Everyone who votes for a losing candidate basically goes unrepresented. That's why it's called winner-take-all. Only one side wins. With proportional representation, instead of using single-seat districts, you use what's known as multi-seat districts, more than one seat per district. And let's say you have a 10-seat district. You can take 10 congressional seats, for instance, single-seat districts, combine them into one district with 10 seats. Okay? Now, with proportional representation, you weigh all the seats equal to the same number of votes. So in a 10-seat district, each seat is worth 10% of the vote. So if a political party gets 20% of the vote in this 10-seat district, how many seats do they get? 2. Right, exactly. Instead of nothing, which is what you get with a winner-take-all system. If they got 40% of the popular vote in a 10-seat district, how many seats would you get? 4, exactly right. And if they got 60% of the popular vote, how many seats in a 10-seat district would they get? 6, right? Instead of getting all the representation, which is how it is in a winner-take-all system. I mean, you all figured that out. That's it. You're experts on proportional representation. It's as easy as that. With proportional representation, basically what you end up with is a multi-party system. You can use these also in nonpartisan elections where you're just electing candidates instead of parties, but just for sake of discussion, let's stick with the example we have. A multi-party legislature where, say, the Democrats and the Republicans win their share of seats, but also maybe a Green Party and a Libertarian Party and a Reform Party or some other party wins representation as well in the legislature. And when you use proportional representation like this, it has additional impacts on the other parameters of democracy that I spoke about earlier: representation, participation, campaigns and discourse, how you campaign, legislative policy, and national unity. All these things are dramatically affected when you start using a proportional representation. To give you one example, proportional representation systems, when you look at all the democracies using it, and most of the established democracies in the world use proportional representation. They don't use our winner-take-all system anymore, and the trend in the world is away from our winner-take-all system and towards these proportional systems. But you see a clear difference. Voter turnout in the proportional systems are anywhere from 75 to 95% of eligible adult voters. Why? Because voters have more choice, right? You have more choices out there in the political landscape, and you have a party or a candidate that is appealing to you for your vote instead of, figuring out whether you're in the right group of swing voters or not. Because when you have a multi-party situation, all voters have a choice to their left and their right. And so in a sense, all voters become swing voters instead of just this narrow group of voters, the undecided voters in the middle, that all the appeals are made to in the winner-take-all system. So all these different parameters are affected by the proportional representation system.
Okay, but now we're talking about adding a much larger number of representatives than one. Where does the money come to pay for all these additional people that are going to be involved?
Well, you don't have to add any. I mean, here in Massachusetts, to use an example, you have 10 U.S. House districts, 10 seats, 1 seat per district. Using the example we just used, you could instead have one statewide district with 10 seats in that district, and a party would need 10% of the vote to win one of those seats. Or you could have 2 districts in eastern and western Massachusetts with 5 seats in that district. And with 5 seats, you just divide the number of seats into 100%, and that tells you the percentage you need to elect seats. So with 5 seats, you'd need 20% of the vote to win one of those seats. So we could do it and keep the legislatures the exact same size they are now.
You are listening to Stephen Hill discussing Fixing Elections, the Failure of America's Winner-Take-All Politics. The floor is now open to the audience for questions and comments. Please go ahead and line up at the microphone. Thank you.
So, quick question. In a system of multi-seat districts like you're describing, do you need to have instant runoff voting to make that work? Do these things go together, or are they separated?
They could go together, but instant runoff voting is not a proportional representation system. It's a majoritarian system. It's a way to elect, for a single office like mayor, governor, or president. It's a way to elect a winner that has a majority of the vote and get it over in one election instead of having to hold a second election. I mean, in Massachusetts, you just had a Democratic gubernatorial primary in which the winner had 32% of the vote. What that means is you can't be certain that the winner of that primary was the candidate preferred by the most voters in that primary. Your voting system completely failed the test of producing a winner that has the most support. So if you'd used something like instant runoff voting where voters could have ranked their second choices and their third choices, you would have ended up with a winner that has a majority of the vote. It might have been the same candidate and would have made her candidacy more legitimate, or it might have been a different candidate.
Yes, you mentioned cumulative voting, in which a person might be given, say, 3 votes. And I was wondering if there is any places that use this kind of voting, how often do people split up their votes and for what reason? Because I've always thought that people would be more likely to put all their votes on their one favorite candidate.
Cumulative voting is used quite a few places in the United States. About 200 jurisdictions use it. A lot of them use it to settle voting rights lawsuits. Also, a lot of corporations use cumulative voting to elect their boards of directors. A good example of a city that uses it is Amarillo, Texas. They use it for their school board elections, and you had a great example there where you had a very diverse population of the city, multiracial, and yet the school board was all white, because they were using a winner-take-all system where the dominant white majority was able to outvote the various racial minorities for all the seats. So they put in cumulative voting to settle a voting rights lawsuit because you couldn't draw a district for any of the particular minority groups. They were too spread out. In the first election in which they used cumulative voting, a Latino and African-American candidate won election to the school board In the second election, another Latino got elected, and the first woman also got elected to the school board using cumulative voting. So here you had a multiracial city where the school board was not reflecting the diversity of their city, and just by changing the voting system to cumulative voting, they were able to get a school board that more looks like their city. Now, in terms of how they divide up their votes, there's no question that in cumulative voting, part of the way the system works is if you're, say, a minority candidate, whether it's a political minority, racial minority, or what have you, you're going to say to your supporters, give me all your votes. Help me to get elected. And some voters may end up splitting their votes, some don't. But there is definitely a tendency in cumulative voting for a certain number of voters anyway to use all their votes for one particular candidate. That's what allows them to express a strong preference for that particular candidate. They also used cumulative voting in Illinois for 110 years, as I mentioned. And what you saw, with these 3-seat districts is that in a more liberal part of the state, 2 of the representatives would be Democrats, the other one would be a Republican. In a more conservative part of the state, 2 would be Republicans, 1 would be a Democrat. So it gave bipartisan representation to all parts of the state, created more cross-pollination of ideas, and also elected, what some of the research shows, it elected more moderates in the legislature, which are the bridge builders between the 2 different parties, and that had some beneficial effects on policy as well.
Yeah, I think your story is very compelling. I'm from the Netherlands, and that's a country which uses proportional representation, and I agree with you that there are many positive consequences, like voter turnout is higher and there are more parties, more women in parliament. But I think there are also some negative consequences, and I would like to know what you think about that. For example, there's no link between the candidate and the voter. I don't know who is in our parliament at all. I only know our political leaders, but that's of the political parties, but that's all. There's no real link. And you can't phone them, for example. Well, you can do that, but you don't know who they are. And the second drawback is I think that you suppose the winner is the Social Democrats. You don't know whether they will rule in government because you have all those negotiations between the political parties and you're never sure whether they will be in the coalitions to form the government.
Before the election, you don't know.
Yeah, before the election, so you don't know whether the winner will be in government. So that is also, well, maybe a drawback. So can you say a little bit more about the negative consequences?
Well, these systems, there's no one type of proportional representation system. The proportional representation is really a principle, and it's just that with a proportional system, blocks of like-minded voters, whether it's political parties in a partisan election or liberals, conservatives, progressives, moderates in a nonpartisan election, that they all win representation in proportion to their voting strength. And then there's different types of proportional systems that conform to this principle. One system that I like is the one that Germany uses, because they combine our district representation with the type of list system that you have in the Netherlands. They have both of them. And the district representation is giving you representation based on where you live, which is an important democratic value. The proportional representation is giving you representation based on what you think, which is also a democratic value. The problem in the United States is we're only getting one of these right now. It's based on where you live. And if you live in the wrong district, you're not getting any representation at all. So I think by combining the two, like the Germans do and New Zealand does and a few other countries, that actually gives you a nice mix, and that might be something that Netherlands might want to try in order to give some connection between the voters and their local constituent. But I also think there's a lot of romanticization about the local representative, that somehow you can call them up and here our U.S. House seats have over 600,000 residents. The idea of calling up your representative and they're going to somehow take care of a problem for you is, that idea died probably around 1850 when the districts became too large. So, and your second part was, the second part of your question, I forgot. Okay, thank you. And thank you for being here and sharing the benefit of your experience from Netherlands.
I assume in your system the party designations would remain. They'd be D or R or G or whatever. Is that true? And the candidates would have been elected by primary or selected by primary and or state convention. Would that be true? Would you have a D or an R and all that stuff?
Well, if we use the list system, which is the type they use in Netherlands and Germany, that's how you do it, where you basically are voting for a party, and the party comes up with a list of candidates, and they do that ahead of time in a party convention. And so when you're voting really for a list of candidates. But there's also other systems like what Cambridge uses here for local government. It's called preference voting, or also known as choice voting. And with that system, you vote for candidates. You rank them like you do with instant runoff voting. You say, here's my first choice, here's my second choice, here's my third choice. So, both systems, there are different systems out there, and you have to figure out for your own city or state which one is the best one for you.
But if there's no party designation, the parties would furiously resist this.
They may. That could be true, but not at local government, And so, here in Cambridge, they have a nonpartisan, party-based proportional representation system. Other places have nonpartisan, why don't the parties resist district elections on a nonpartisan basis?
If you have the designation, let us suppose I'm a registered member of one of the parties. Since I'm in Cambridge, let's say it's the Democratic Party. Suppose there are 5 candidates listed, 2 Ds, 1 R, a G, and an L. 5 candidates. What is to prevent me from bullet voting and simply listing the 2 Ds, 1, 2, and nobody else?
Nothing. If that's what you want to do as a voter, if you only want to rank the 2 Democrats, it's completely optional. In these ranked ballot systems, you only have to rank as many as you'd like to rank.
So you can bullet vote with this system if the parties are designated?
Well, it's not technically bullet voting. I mean, bullet voting is a system where, like with an at-large system, you have 4 votes. And you decide not to use all 4 of those votes. You only use one of them because you're afraid that using your other votes, you're going to help someone else get elected who is not your favorite candidate. With instant runoff voting, where you're ranking your candidates, you're picking your first choice, and the second choice is a runoff choice. So if you decide not to put a second choice, it's just like not coming back to the runoff election. That's what it's really more like.
But if I vote only once on that ballot of 5 political designees, would my vote count on the first go-round?
Yeah,
it would.
If I understand how you're asking, yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Speaking to the benefits of our current system, I think it's clear that there are a lot of negatives, but when we look, for example, at the number of governments Italy has had since World War II, if we look at the instability of the governments in Israel, we can see that there are problems with proportional representation in terms of stability. One of the things that Madison did when he created this monstrosity that we have was to create a system that made it hard for government to do anything. And he succeeded admirably in doing that. But as a result, once the government commits itself to do something, we have a situation where there's very little incentive to try to undo it because it took so much effort to get it done. And we don't have the kind of flip-flop that we've seen elsewhere in the world with proportional representation, going back and forth in policy. So I would submit to you that a countervailing benefit of our current system is the tendency towards stability that it does create. I'd like your comment on that.
Sure. Thank you for raising the question. It's interesting you should mention James Madison. It's interesting to know that James Madison, as well as Alexander Hamilton and James Wilson, 3 of the most brilliant minds of the Constitutional Convention, were opposed to the current structure of the United States Senate. They were opposed to giving representation based on a state. They said, what is this artificial body of states? Isn't it not people we want to give representation to? So, the founders and framers did not all agree on lots of the structures that we ended up with. And in fact, in many ways, for instance, they predicted in the U.S. House of Representatives that there would be 50% turnover in the U.S. House of Representatives, and they created the Senate to be kind of the stable body to counteract that. And now in the United States House of Representatives, turnover rate among incumbents is 99% of incumbents get reelected. They were wrong, just simply wrong, on many of the things they thought the political system was going to produce. The Electoral College is another great example. They created that thinking one thing. It backfired within a single election, prompting a constitutional amendment. So, what they thought they were doing is not necessarily what we ended up with, and we're dealing with some of the problems of that ever since. To comment on your question about Italy and Israel, of course, this is what gets raised all the time with proportional representation systems. And I would ask you to think about the following. First of all, most of the established democracies in the world today use proportional representation. As I said, most of them do not use winner-take-all, and the trend in the world is away from our winner-take-all system. And virtually none of them have the problems of Italy and Israel. So judging an entire classification of voting systems by the experience of two nations is simply not valid on an empirical basis, okay? The other thing I would offer to you to think about is that with proportional representation, it's actually possible to fine-tune your democracy. Do you want it to be broadly inclusive, electing all sorts of points of view and political parties? Use a 1% threshold like Israel uses. You'll elect all sorts of parties, fringe parties, religious parties, all sorts of things. Do you want it to be really exclusive and not elect very many points of view at all? Use a winner-take-all system like we do here in the United States, where only two parties have a chance. You know, I mean, here we are in a country where choice is supposed to be a mantra of the times, and the free market and all these sorts of things, and yet in our political system we only have really two choices. Not that there aren't third parties out there trying mightily, but the winner-take-all system by formation is a two-party system. So experience around the world suggests that there's a happy medium between Israel and the United States. If you use, for instance, a 5% threshold like Germany uses, or even a 10% threshold like Cambridge uses for its local elections, experience suggests that what you'll end up with is the following. You'll end up with two major parties that get elected and win most of the seats, and you'll end up with anywhere from 2 to 3, maybe 4 political parties that win seats in the legislature. Those smaller parties will win usually no more than 10% of the vote, but those small parties play an important function in the government. They are the laboratory for new ideas. That's where new ideas get brought into the political discussion and debate, and then the two mainstream parties tend to take up these ideas as they see fit, trying to attract more voters. And you compare that to the winner-take-all system. I mean, you talk about just, in the proportional systems, a small parties crashing governments and these sorts of things. Compare that to the winner-take-all system where, as I said earlier, you have just a small handful of voters in a handful of states that are determining our presidential election. You know, it's the same sort of thing, but in a different way. And so when you have a system like winner-take-all, where basically you have only two parties and two choices, and they're carving out their positions vis-a-vis each other using the polls and the focus groups and dial meter groups and all these techniques they use today, and they're figuring out which groups of voters to ignore and which groups of voters to talk to. And in that process, just a small handful of voters really get all the say in our political system. And so I would assert to you that if Israel were to raise its threshold from 1% to, say, 4%, like Sweden uses, or 5%, like Germany uses, you would see a lot of these smaller parties going away. They would not be able to win that many votes, and they would not win seats. So, we can fine-tune our democracy using what's called the victory threshold of proportional representation.
I think it's really fascinating to think about some of these different possibilities for democratic voting and so forth. I'd like to just raise a point or two, if I might, regarding the primary process in recent presidential elections. In a friendly sort of challenge to your point about only 50% or so voted in the most recent presidential election, I would contend the actual percentage is somewhat higher, quite a bit higher. For example, my guy got blown out in the primaries. I'm sure that happened to a lot of other people's first choice, too. It seems at the end of the primary season we're traditionally left with the problem of holding our nose and voting for Tweedledum or Tweedledummer, as I've heard it expressed. I kind of could wish that we could have like Team B and have another set of primaries. Okay, this time let's say McCain versus Bradley or whoever. I think that would make it a lot more interesting. Just one other point on that. I think back to 1988, a very intriguing thing happened. When Dukakis won the Democratic nomination. When that started, he was not particularly strong in the polls or even that well known, I don't think. But some of the strong people like Gebhardt, Gore, didn't get the kind of support they needed, Paul Simon of Illinois. Well, by the time half or fewer of the primaries were done, I remember the only two men standing, really, were Dukakis and Jesse Jackson, even though the other guys' names might have been on many other ballots. And some sort of cynical people thought, a lot of white liberal Democrats said, yeah, I'd love to vote for a black man or a woman if it's making a statement, but hey, this guy might actually win. Uh-oh. So all of a sudden we saw Dukakis getting 70-80% of the vote in the last half of the primaries. Well, theoretically, everybody might have just woken up those mornings and said, hey, I really like Dukakis now. I doubt that really happened. So again, it's something I find frustrating. It's like things get short-circuited before we get to the end of the primary season. I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, I'll tell you what the thought that comes to mind, and I'm not sure if it's exactly addressing your question, but it's my belief, after I've come to the conclusion that we have too many elections in this country. Part of the reason why voters don't turn out is there's just too many darn elections. People can't even keep track, I mean, what election is this? What offices are we electing? In California, we elect a statewide office called the Board of Equalization. I've gone around California talking, a lot. I have asked everywhere I go, what is the Board of Equalization? What do they do? I haven't found a single person yet that knows. Okay, so I'm sort of more of the mind these days that we should get rid of primary elections. We can use instant runoff voting. You don't need to use a primary election with instant runoff voting. Let everybody run. You rank your ballot, rank your candidates, and at the end of the process, the winner's going to have a majority of the vote. That would be better than what we do now, where we drag the campaign season out. You have a primary maybe in March, and then voters turn out to vote, or maybe they don't. Often the voter turnout in primaries is extremely low. And then you wait another 6 or 7 months for the general election, and voters, they have to sort of remember, who is this again? What are we voting for? So I say, get it over in one election. One election, not two. Have the campaign season start in September. It's over in, maybe 2.5 months maximum. And let's see if that doesn't make voters value their elections more because there's fewer of them. I don't know, something to think about.
I have 2 questions, actually. First, what steps need to be taken to change the current voting system that we have now? And secondly, you mentioned voter apathy among young people, and I'm just wondering if you can give some figures, especially in terms of what party young people are usually voting for these days, and maybe some trends that will happen in the next few generations.
Sure. Well, let's talk about the young people, 18 to 24-year-olds first. What party are they voting for? The answer is they're not. They're not voting for any party. In the 2002 congressional elections, we're still waiting for the final figures, but about maybe 18% of 18 to 24-year-olds turned out to vote. Okay. And, it's interesting, when you look at proportional representation systems, for instance, you don't see these huge drop-offs among younger people and poor people and these certain demographics like you do in the United States. And why is that? Well, here's an anecdote to think about. In Germany, the Green Party put on their list a 19-year-old candidate, a woman. She was out there campaigning, trying to get young people to turn out to vote, addressing their issues. She was able to address their issues. Why? Because she's a young person. I mean, what a concept, that somehow young people should maybe be able to get elected to our national legislature and represent that constituency. Sweden also recently elected a 19-year-old to their national legislature. New Zealand, same thing. There's a Rastafarian, got elected to the legislature. He's about 24, 25 years old. Again, he appeals to young people, talks to young people because he is a young person. You compare that to the types of candidates that the winner-take-all system produces. This is really, I think, in some ways the crux of where our system is failing us most, is that the connection between voters and the candidates is being severed. Election after election is just simply being severed because most voters look at the candidates today and they don't see any part of themselves reflected. They're either in the wrong demographic or they're, and so the candidates don't even look like them, they don't sound like them, they don't think about the issues that they think about, or, you're not in the right group of swing voters. And so you're just cut out of the political process. So, I think if we're really going to engage young people again, we're going to have to convert to proportional representation. It's really the only way to do it, because then we'll be able to produce a different type of candidate that can get out there and run and win. That's really the key. They've got to be able to offer that hope of, look, you vote for me, I can win. Okay? So without that, I don't see that young people are going to get back involved anytime soon. I think it's all the different efforts out there are noble that are trying, but they're basically targeted at the wrong thing. So, and the second part of your...
Yeah, just to tail that, I just heard that a lot of young people in the 2000 election actually voted for Bush. And is that true? You haven't heard that?
No,
Okay,
it is true that more young people today are voting Republican than used to, but I haven't heard that it's a greater number. But another interesting aspect to this is that there is evidence that young people are volunteering their time more than they used to, getting more involved in civic and community things. They're just not putting it into the political arena. And I think it's sort of, I call it the wisdom of youth. They know whether it's worth getting involved in. They're very rational about it. They know, look, this is a mug's game. What's there in it for me? I'm a busy person. I don't have time for this. I'll put my energy over here. Oh.
The second question is what steps need to be taken to change the system?
Yes. The first thing we need to do to change the system is we need to educate all of each other that there's even a different way of doing it. Forums like this, I've got some literature here about instant runoff voting and how it works. Take some, give it to a friend, give it to a colleague, a coworker, or a family member. Tell them, hey, I went to a presentation last night, heard a speaker, some interesting ideas discussed. Read this and let me know what you think. Each one of you can start the process of education, because what we're doing right now is planting seeds, helping people to understand that we're not stuck in this 18th century winner-take-all system forever. There is another way to do this, but most people don't even know that. So that's really the basic thing. Then once you take that step and you want to get more involved, then you do things like, maybe forming a local group. Like I just came back from Amherst, Massachusetts, and Northampton area, where they formed a local group because they want to start pushing instant runoff voting. And there's also a group here in Massachusetts now called Mass IRV. The website, I believe, is massirv.org. And they have 3 bills that have been introduced into the state legislature. One would use instant runoff voting for primary elections. The other would use instant runoff voting for all your statewide offices. And the third would use instant runoff voting for congressional elections. So, you form a local group, start supporting these bills, contacting your legislator. You can go to your city council member and ask them, look, how about setting up a commission to study whether any of these voting systems would help elections and democracy in our local area? And oftentimes, they're willing to do that. It doesn't cost money often to set up a commission if everyone volunteers their time. And so you start a process that then you can get people involved in, writing letters to the editor, getting on talk radio, basically talking it up. Using these voting systems within your own organizations. How many people here are member of different organizations? Quite a few. Well, you can use instant runoff voting if your organization does endorsements at election time. There's several organizations in San Francisco that use instant runoff voting to make their endorsements because they want to make sure the winners have support of the club or organization, and they want to do it in one election instead of calling everyone back for a second election. You can use it to elect your officers. So by doing this, all these different ways, we start introducing these ideas to the American public. About the only thing that Milton Friedman ever said that I agree with is that at times of crisis, society casts about for new ideas from the solutions that are available at the time. And there's no question in my mind that the trends that I've been talking about are going to get worse over the next 10 to 15 years. You think it's bad now, it's going to get worse. And at a certain point, if enough people have been out there talking about proportional representation and instant runoff voting, those ideas are going to be more on people's tongues, and they're going to start saying, hey, why don't we try this? So, it's a long-term project. But, how many people in 1980 thought that the Berlin Wall was going to fall in 9 years, right? So hope springs eternal.
Within legislator, though, like within government, what needs to happen as far as
they just need to pass a bill.
Just a bill.
Yeah, they just need to pass a bill to reform the laws that establish the elections. And at the local government level, you pass a new charter amendment or whatever is defining the elections in your city or state. You just have to change that. There's no. Let me just say, there's no obstacles, for instance, in the United States Constitution that says we can't do anything like this, that would make it unconstitutional. As well as, we could elect in the Electoral College. Each state was left up to each state to decide for themselves how to choose their electors by the Constitution. Each state could use, for instance, a proportional representation allocation, where if a candidate wins 60% of the popular vote, they get 60% of the Electoral College votes instead of all of them. And if another candidate got 40% of the popular vote, they get 40% of the Electoral College votes instead of none of them. What this would do if we use this method, remember how I talked about 40 states were done deals and only 10 of them were up for grabs, and that's where all the campaigns went, is to those 10 states? It would make all states, in a sense, more competitive. Because if you as a candidate expected, hey, I'm going to get 40% of the vote in this state and get 40% of the Electoral College votes, but if I go spend some time there and campaign there, I might get 45% of the vote and get more Electoral College votes. So suddenly you have, more of the states are going to become competitive, and the candidates are going to have to get out there and talk to more people instead of the narrow group of swing voters in a handful of states that they talk to now. So,
yeah, I was wondering which of these reforms seems to be most likely eventually to succeed, for the country to accept or a state to accept, and would it be different at the national level than at the state or local level?
That's a very good question. I don't think there's any one-size-fits-all here. Every city and state is somewhat different. You got, some might want to use a mixed system combining districts with proportional representation. Some might want to use cumulative voting. It really depends. But I'll say, a personal favorite of mine is kind of the Finnish system, what they use in Finland, where the candidates run from districts, just like we do here, and you vote for your candidate in your district, but it also becomes a vote for the party list. And they figure out the proportion of vote that each party wins. If a party gets 30% of the vote, they get 30% of the seats. And then the winners come from these district races. So you get kind of a mix of district representation, geographic representation, and proportional representation. And voters would be voting just like they do now. There would be no difference. So I think that's kind of an interesting system to think about for the United States.
Hi. Regarding voter turnout, one of the arguments I've heard as to why voter turnout is so low lately is because of how we vote. In a world where you can check your bank balance or email your grandmother from anywhere in the world, you still have to go to a certain place on a work day, usually in the middle of your work day, to cast a vote. I mean, I've had situations where I've worked pretty far from home and I've had to miss an election because I couldn't get home in time. So Oregon uses mail-in ballots. Other ideas that have been bandied around are multi-day elections, elections on weekends. Your views on that?
Very good point. We're asking voters to vote on the first Tuesday in November in the middle of a busy work day, whereas I've been outlining there's really not that much to vote for anyway. I mean, that's a no-brainer, I would think, and yet it's incredibly tough to make even just voting on holidays. I mean, most other nations vote on a weekend. When does Netherlands vote? On a Sunday?
Wednesday, usually.
Wednesday?
Yeah.
In the middle of a work day?
Yeah.
Well,
but they're discussing moving it to the weekend as well, because they have the same problem there. So it has been a point of discussion.
Germany votes on Sunday. A lot of countries vote on the weekend, or on a holiday. To me, this just makes sense. Yeah, I mean, some people forget why we vote on the first Tuesday in November. It was established in the 1840s by President James Polk. He established it on that date as a way to help farmers be able to get to Election Day on Tuesday. I mean, I guess farmers brought in the crops on the weekend and needed time to get to the polls on Tuesday. Here we are in 2003. Most people are not farmers anymore. And, we always revere the things we've done in the past, whether it's the founders or the framers. And, most people probably think the framers said it the first Tuesday in November. They don't know that James Polk said it, And so, again, sometimes we're so ridiculously bogged down in just, we're stuck to the flypaper of old ideas. I mean, how else can you say it? I mean, to give you another example, here we are, the most powerful nation in the world. We held a presidential election, and we couldn't count the votes, right? The voting equipment completely broke down in Florida. And not only Florida, other places as well. And you take a country like Brazil. Okay, Brazil just had its national presidential election. It's a country that's as large as the United States, geographically speaking. Huge population, multiracial population, all those sorts of things. And in Brazil, the voter goes into the voter's booth. The voting equipment is all computerized. It's a national system, so they don't have over 3,000 counties like we have, each doing it a different way, making it up as they go along. It's a national system. The voter pushes a button for their candidate. A picture of the candidate they just pushed the button for comes up on the computer screen. They can visually verify, yes, that's the person I wanted. No overvotes. No undervotes, no, like Jews for Buchanan, like we saw in Florida because of the result of that butterfly ballot, right? I mean, this is ridiculous. This is not rocket science. And not to knock the country of Brazil, but how is it that the United States is playing catch-up to Brazil when it comes to voting equipment? And just in so many ways, we are incredibly backward, and we don't want to set national standards. We want to leave it decentralized in all these sorts of ways. So these are other things that we all have to start talking about and pushing on. And so, those of you who want to get involved in this issue, I recommend you go to your election administrators and talk to them. Ask them, what kind of voting equipment do we use? A lot of counties are now going to be buying new voting equipment because they just passed a federal bill allocating several $1 billion to buy new voting equipment. Florida did prompt some change. So go to those election administrators and say, what equipment are you thinking about buying? Can it handle ranked ballots? Is it going to be able to handle instant runoff voting? You want to make sure they buy the right voting equipment and let them know that people are watching what they're doing, so.
Okay, I'm a confirmed third-party voter. I voted for Ralph Nader in the 2000 election, and I just have a philosophy that it's not enough to vote for someone who can win. I've got to vote for someone who's worth the position I'm voting them in for. But I'm just wondering, I think to some extent being a third-party voter is a good tactic to eventually win what you're talking about, this instant runoff voting or proportional representation, because I can't help but feel that this is putting some pressure on the Democrats, if they ever want to make an alliance with the Greens, to talk about these types of voting systems that you're talking about. And I'm wondering if you've seen evidence where third-party pressure is actually putting pressure on Democrats to adopt these systems.
Yes, it is happening. You look at states like New Mexico, for instance, where the Green Party spoiled the Democrats for 2 congressional seats plus the governor's seat over the last few years. And that made a believer out of some Democrats in instant runoff voting. They pushed instant runoff voting through the Senate, passed the Senate, died in the House. Other Democrats took the opposite reaction and said, let's wipe this Green Party off the ballot. So there's this kind of tussle going on in New Mexico right now over this. In other states like Alaska, the Republican Party is pushing instant runoff voting because they're being spoiled by conservative third parties. So there's no question that when these spoiler candidacies emerge, it puts pressure on the system. It reveals that the voting system is broken. Whenever you get a multi-candidate race like that, I mean, the United States Senate was in the hands of the Democrats for a couple of years. I'm sure you all recall. It was only because a Libertarian Party candidate in Washington State spoiled the Republican incumbent for the Senate, and the Democrat won. And so it's happening on both sides of the political aisle, and it's kind of frustrating for voters because it means the voting system is not reflecting what voters really want. So the spoiler issue, I think, is not going to go away, nor should it. Parties should be able to run their candidates because what it's about is getting information to voters so voters make a good choice about who's the best representative. That's what parties are doing, whether it's major parties or minor parties. And so the idea that somehow third parties should back off, not vote, not run, not spoil, to me is the wrong solution. The solution is to change the voting system that doesn't make room for all the different parties that offer solutions and proposals and policies to voters.
It strikes me from what you've said that there is one group of people for whom the current electoral system works very well, and that group is the incumbents, who are exactly the people who are going to have to make these changes. Do you have any ideas about how to convince them to make changes in the system that's working very well for them?
It's a very good question. I sometimes, when I think about this question, I say we're waiting for our Gorbachev, someone who sees that we've got to open up the system and they're part of the political elite and they make some sort of bid for whatever reason, whether it's self-interest or altruism, whatever, to lead the charge to open up the political system. Having said that, I have seen incumbents, like in New Mexico, where they were getting spoiled by the Green Party. Suddenly, it was in their self-interest to start making some of these changes. And in San Francisco, we passed instant runoff voting just last March. I was the campaign manager for that effort. And we had the endorsement from the Democratic Party, from the largest labor unions, from, a lot of the organizations that are usually tied to the political machine and the status quo powers that be. And, they went for it because we were using this December runoff election. Awful time for election. Voter turnout was dropping by 50%. It was costing millions of dollars to put on this second election. It was undermining campaign finance reform because candidates had to raise money for this second election. It just wasn't a popular election. So when it was a better solution was presented to them, to their credit, they said, hey, let's give this a try. So I think incumbents sometimes will do the right thing, but there's no question that is an uphill battle. I mean, trying to imagine Thomas Finneran going for proportional representation is...
Well, it isn't so hard for some people. I'm Alice Wolf, and I'm the state representative in this district where you're sitting. And I have filed, and I'm the co-sponsor of the 3 bills that have been filed in the Massachusetts legislature for instant runoff voting. So I just wanted people to know that there will be an effort in the legislature this year to push that legislation forward. What the bills would cover would be the statewide elections, the statewide final elections, statewide primaries, and the congressional elections. And this is just a fledgling beginning, but some incumbents are doing it.
Here's our Gorbachev. Thank you very much.
To be fair, that my colleague Ellen Story from Amherst is the other person who's the lead sponsor in these bills.
Right, you know, and around Representative Story's district last year, there were 2 advisory referendums on the ballot asking whether the voters of the Amherst, Northampton area, whether they wanted to use instant runoff voting for state elections. And those referendums passed overwhelmingly. Over 2/3 of voters. I think one of them even had 70% of the vote. So, you know, it's going to take time, but if we all do a little bit, every journey starts with the first step, right? And so here we have 3 legislative bills that have been introduced. Everybody can find out what those bill numbers are. If you go to the website massirv.org, when they have bill numbers, you'll be able to see what they are, call up your representative and say, please support these bills, you know, and they don't have bill numbers yet. They'll have them shortly, and just check the massirv.org website to find out what they are.
Stephen, one thing that we haven't talked about in too great detail is, you know, the huge role of money in elections, regardless of what the system is. And last year we had Kirk Walter and Ford Fessenden, who were the architects of the NORC study on the 2000 election results, and we asked Kirk Walter, you know, what do we need to do in terms of making a common system? And he says that he endorses a national system, but he was talking about the enormous expense that it would take, you know, 3,000 districts, I think is what you said, to make that change. And of course the people, as it has been pointed out, that are in power don't necessarily want to change a system that is benefiting them very well. And that also would go in terms of the financing of campaigns. So we have to talk about campaign finance reform in some respects to work with this as well. I was wondering if you could address that at all.
Sure. I just to touch on the point you raised just briefly about, you know, it'll be expensive to replace voting equipment in all 3,000 counties. It will be. That's called an investment. It's an investment in our democratic infrastructure. If Brazil can do it, we can do it too. In terms of campaign finance reform, public financing of elections, I believe that proportional representation and public financing elections are both extremely important. They're almost like the 2 wings of the airplane. You need them both to fly. You know, to me, public financing of elections it's kind of an infrastructure question, really. I mean, you think about it, we wouldn't ask the political parties to count their own ballots, right? There's an obvious conflict of interest there. So we pay for that. The public pays for that. It's the best way to do it. Similarly, we shouldn't ask the political parties and the private citizens to finance the means by which we get information into the hands of voters. That's what it's really about, is getting information into the hands of voters. That should be publicly financed as well, whether we do it through free airtime, through you know, giving money to the candidates, franking privilege, whatever, you know, or all of them. You know, I mean, the free airtime, to me, it seems to be a no-brainer. You know, the broadcasters receive their license to use the public's airwaves from us, and they're giving it to them for free. And they're supposed to give it, in return, they're supposed to give candidates what's called the LUC rate, the lowest unit cost rate, to make it affordable for candidates. Except there was a huge loophole in the federal law that established this. It said if you get the LUC rate, you can't be guaranteed when your ad will run. I mean, can you imagine in the middle of a campaign, oh, sure, Senator, we'll take your ad, we'll give you the LUC rate, but we can't guarantee when it's going to run. Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. And so, as a result, candidates have to pay top dollar for the TV ads. And the other interesting aspect to this is in the last 15 years, the broadcasters have been slowly reducing the amount of time they give to political coverage and to candidates. So think about what's happening here. The broadcasters basically have a profit motive to cover the candidates as little as possible and force them to buy TV time. That's what's going on. I mean, it's a complete ripoff of the public airwaves. So I think that we should require broadcasters for the right to have this broadcasting license. We should be requiring them to give free airtime to candidates. So, I think that that's essential. The other thing I do want to emphasize about campaign finance reform, as I mentioned earlier, most districts are not competitive because of how they're drawn in the redistricting process. So for most legislative races, it's not so much that the money is buying elections. Sometimes we see after elections 9 out of 10 winners in congressional races were the ones who raised the most money. Well, this is kind of turning the facts on their heads. Of course they raised the most money. The donors knew who were going to win. I mean, if you're a donor, you're going to give to the horse you know is going to win, right? Why would you give to a loser? Because you're buying access. It's an important distinction to make that in terms of campaign finance reform, that the donors are giving money to the candidates they know are going to win because the district has been drawn to produce that result. And so, the money is playing a negative role in our system, but it's not always the way that sometimes it's portrayed. Yeah.
Just generally, I'm very much in favor of these things, but I do have one devil's advocate type question. If these changes are implemented, do you think it could become a problem that you would have huge numbers of candidates? Just like way too many candidates that the general population would be able to figure out who they actually wanted to vote for or who everybody stood for and so forth.
Well, let's ask some of the Cambridge folks. Alice Wolf, David Leslie, are there too many candidates in the Cambridge City Council proportional representation elections?
No. The number of candidates now are way down compared to what they were when PR first came in.
What about...
So there's 9 seats being elected, and typically how many candidates will run?
18 maybe. Yeah, 20 of whom several are usually what we might consider as minor, candidates who don't really have too much of a shot at it.
Right. So, and in the meantime, like in San Francisco, for the mayoral race last time, I think there were 15 candidates to elect 1 seat. So, I'm not sure we can tailor our voting system based on it'll produce too many candidates. I mean, heaven forbid we should have that problem. In Los Angeles County, for instance, not that long ago, they canceled elections because there were no candidates running against the safe seat incumbents, okay? Which in California law, if there's not a race, you can cancel the elections. They did that in all these cities in Los Angeles County. So heaven forbid we should have the opposite problem of too many candidates.
Do you have a sense in other countries also if it's been an issue at all?
Of too many candidates? No, because especially with the proportional systems where you have, say, the list systems, the candidates they're not running necessarily from districts anymore, at least in most of these countries, and they run more as a team. They're pooling resources, and so your voters are voting more conceptually. I want to vote for the Green Party, or I want to vote for the Social Democratic Party, rather than you're voting for a specific candidate. I mean, sometimes the parties will feature a particular candidate, like in Germany, the Green Party, the main candidate is Joschka Fischer, and Social Democrats obviously was Gerhard Schroeder. And so, there's that aspect, but generally speaking, no, you don't see too many candidates in any of these, to the point where voters are overwhelmed and can't figure out what to do.
Okay, so to wrap us up, Stephen, in an ideal world, give us a thumbnail sketch of what you think our national election should look like.
Sure. We should have a National Elections Commission that oversees elections, partners with the states to make sure they happen in a fair way, make sure the voting equipment is state-of-the-art, is at least as good as Brazil's. We should have universal voter registration. In most nations, if you breathe and have a pulse, you're allowed to vote. But the United States is rather alone among democracies in the world in erecting all these barriers to actually getting to vote at all. So we would have universal voter registration, whereas anyone who turns 18, they get a packet in the mail from the Secretary of State in their state saying, congratulations, you are now registered to vote. We would have public financing of elections so that all parties have the means to get the word out about their positions and their policies, and voters have enough information to make a good decision. We would have proportional representation at local, state, and federal levels to make sure our representative bodies are representative of the great and wonderful diversity of our nation. And to make sure that the campaigns in our country are not just these negative hack-attack campaigns, but that they're coming from places of party platforms and principled candidates who are talking to voters about their ideas for our future instead of the latest sound bites trying to appeal to a small pocket of swing voters that are going to determine the elections. That is, a few of the things I would like to see for the future of our democracy.
Thank you, Stephen Hill.